Would you like to introduce yourself to start with?
Yeah, so I'm Ali Lambie, and thank you for asking me along to talk with you.
Pleasure.
Yeah, and I guess the main reason that you've invited me is because I'm immersed in the whole world of mindfulness. I actually run something that's known as Mindfulness Hampshire, and it does what it says on the tin. I'm based in Hampshire. I actually live just outside of Eastleigh, and what I do, my business is mindfulness. It's actually morphed a bit over the years, and I'm much more involved in something called mindful self-compassion that perhaps we'll come to
Mm.
in a little while. But that's who I am. Yeah, I'm Ali, and I'm from Mindfulness Hampshire.
You've worn a lot of hats in this field, haven't you?
I guess I kind of have in a way. I mean, I think like for many of us, life unfolds and develops in various ways. I mean, I started back in the sort of therapeutic world as a counsellor back in the 90s. And it was during my time when I was involved in that whole aspect of work that I came across mindfulness. It was strange, actually. I remember it clearly. I was in a clinical supervision session with my supervisor at the time, and I was talking about a particular woman that I'd been working with. And she said, "Oh, I don't know. I wonder if a mindfulness approach might be quite helpful with this particular client." And I said to her at the time, I said, mindfulness is one of those things that it seems to have become quite popular. It's out there and people are talking about it, but I don't really know that clearly what it is. Um, and she had just been sent a book to review. And she said, "Oh, well, why not have a look at this book? I'm not going to get to read it for a little while. Why don't you take this home and have a look?" And I read it, and it was one of those moments when it's like, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense to me. This speaks to me so clearly. I have to follow this up.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that's, when you talk about being, wearing different hats. So I very much started, in a sense, in relation to mindfulness, started from the therapist perspective, then came, had that kind of lightning bolt kind of
Mm.
conversation with my supervisor who put me onto this book. And as a result of that, I then thought I need to, I want to experience a mindfulness training as participant. So it was in the early days of mindfulness being that widespread, and it seems extraordinary to me now. So I was working in Southampton, living outside, about half an hour commute, single parent, 3 kids, full on job, and the nearest mindfulness course I could find was in Bristol. you know, Seems a bit bonkers, but it just happened to fit with my schedule. So every Monday evening for 8 weeks after work, I got on a train and went off to Bristol and took this 8 week mindfulness course. Um, and it was it was interesting because it was, having been immersed in therapy and the therapeutic world, obviously in my training and my practice, and prior to all of that, been on the receiving end of it, which I think is the way many of us get into this field. So, life's inevitable struggles and finding some therapy help for myself. And so, I need to follow this up, and then ended up training, blah, blah, blah. And here I was, traveling to Bristol for 8 weeks to take this mindfulness course. And it just, somehow it spoke to me in ways that all of the therapeutic work hadn't quite. And I think it was to do with the embodiment. It was something about, it was a particularly, intense experience of feeling in my body the emotions, and noticing the thoughts, noticing the feelings, but actually that felt sense in the body just felt for me particularly a really helpful awareness to discover, which I hadn't. I noticed a feeling slightly uncomfortable. Was I not really that aware as a therapist of what was going on in my body? But I think it was a question of degree, and the degree to which really connecting with this overall felt sense of what was emerging was really transformational. And then as a result of that, taking that initial 8 week course as a participant, I thought, what, I want to take this further. Maybe I could train. So again, it sounds a bit bonkers, particularly thinking back to my life situation at the time. But I started researching was, so, how do you train to teach this? How do you train to teach mindfulness? And back then there were fewer opportunities, and the main organisations offering mindfulness training were Exeter, Oxford, and Bangor universities. And of course, Oxford was probably nearest, but and I contacted all three, but there was just something about Bangor.
Mm.
And I'm not sure what it was, but I think for me, it was something about just following my instincts, following my heart. There was something about my initial contact with them. I had a a telephone interview, and just felt that sense of connection and just felt drawn to it. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. Bangor's 7 hours away, whether by train or by road. And, anyway, long story short, I embarked on the master's program there, and it's a complete life changer, both personally and professionally. It was just awesome.
I think, although I'm obviously a lot later to the game, I'd definitely share some of your sentiments there. One, that it's life changing, and two, that it's quite hard to put into words the sense of what it's like to do some mindfulness for the first time. It's hard to convey, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So we can talk about it forever, I think, but you
Yeah.
can't quite get the same sense of, experiential feel of it. Yeah. So it's difficult when you're recruiting participants as well, because how do you give them a feel? We actually need to start by telling them a little bit about it, but very rapidly inviting them to join in practice, I think, to get a sense of it.
Was there a delay between you buying into the idea of mindfulness and, I don't want to say fully incorporating it into your daily life, because I don't know if any of us fully incorporate it all the time, but was there a delay for you? Because I found that I really bought into the idea, and then I was like, well, it's probably been a couple of weeks now since I've really done some.
Oh, definitely. And I think, it still waxes and wanes, and here I am. I mean, I suppose a blessing in a way of being a mindfulness teacher is I'm kind of having to practice all the time, because I'm teaching all the time, teaching quite a lot. But, in periods when I'm not teaching, it's I suppose it's pretty routine that I will start the day with a formal practice, and kind of informal practice will kind of weave its way in and out of my daily life. But there are certainly periods when, especially in the early days, when I'd notice all the things that all our participants, of course, come up against, like resistance and boredom, and what's the point, and does this work, and can't be bothered, all of that, absolutely. So like you, I think I had a kind of intellectual buy-in at the beginning, as right from reading that book I mentioned, just like, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense, absolutely, got to follow this. But there was a difference between making that kind of cognitive decision and actually, putting it into practice in a routine and regular way. Yeah.
We've probably preaching to the converted somewhat, given that this show is going out. It's a mindfulness show. But what would you say to those who perhaps are in that stage of cognitively buying into it but not yet practicing? How did you get started?
Well, I think there was a sense in which, good question. I mean, I suppose taking the first 8-week course when I was going to Bristol, as you'll know from an 8-week training, you are given home practice to do each thing, do the body scan every day until we meet again, all of that. And I think I do, I mean, as I think many people do on their initial training, go through, oh, well, I started off with a great, the first week was really evangelical, oh, I'm going to do this every day, and actually then carving out the time became a bit of a chore, and so on. But I think I often came back to, what's the point of traveling to Bristol, doing all this, spending this money and this time, if I'm not actually going to really give it a full go? So I think I probably practiced more in that initial training than I did afterwards. And after the initial 8-week training, inevitably my practice lapsed. It was really difficult to keep it up, to embed it regularly in my life. And interestingly, kind of winding the clock forward a little bit, when I did my master's degree at Bangor University, my thesis topic was supporting people after an 8-week training, because there's so much evidence, pre and post measures about, how people are before they begin a mindfulness training, how they are after their mindfulness training. But there's very little, or relatively little, about actually what happens to people further down the line. How, do they actually embed this as a way of being going forwards? And it's very variable. So one of the things that I do, and which I did right from it came from a particular group that I was working with, one of my very early MBSR groups, mindfulness-based stress reduction groups, for the general public. And there was a group that they'd connected, they bonded particularly well, and they approached me at the end of the 8 weeks and they said, Ali, we know we're going to really struggle to keep up our practice. do you think you could keep on offering us something? Is there something we could do, even if we just came once a month or something or other? And so from that initial approach, I thought, well, you know, maybe I could do something like that. So I started offering a monthly committed group, and that then became the you know, I did some qualitative research for my master's thesis around that, and I've been running groups ever since, and I've now got 3 rolling monthly committed groups that have been going for the longest one about 6 years, I think. It's what I call a slow rolling group. So people leave from time to time and join from time to time, but it's a closed group in that you're signed up for the group and it's a commitment. And that came out in the research as really quite important in terms of supporting people with their practice, that you know, they're committed, they're a group member, they get to know other group members, a little bit like in the 8 weeks people often kind of, you know, bond a bit with their peers. Well, these are a kind of a slower roll, but you know, there are people that have known each other for many years now. And interesting, yeah, just going to say it was kind of helpful that I had the therapeutic background and had been used to running groups and so on, because I, you know, naively I said, oh yes, I can do that, and hadn't quite anticipated. Of course, there's a huge difference between kind of holding the space and holding a group for 8 weeks and 6 years. So we've had a number of deaths, we've had a lot of illness, we've had births, we've had divorces, we've had, you know, the whole range of life, of course, showing up in the group members over time. So, you know, it's become a really, you know, a rich and really very lovely aspect of my work, that I do run these ongoing practice support groups. I'm aware that's a slight tangent from your original question about kind of embedding my practice. But, yeah.
Some really interesting points there, actually, though. I think many coming into mindfulness will practice on their own. But there's something of a community in what you talk about there, isn't there?
Absolutely.
How can people access that, or perhaps might they set up their own?
Yeah, well, there are actually, I mean, there are loads of online offerings, you know, even more so than ever during this time of pandemic. There are loads out there, but in terms of my particular, just via my website, just get in touch. I do a monthly drop-in. In fact, that was last night. So the drop-in is just for anybody to drop in. So it can be people who have taken a mindfulness training. It could be people who are completely new to it. So they can, it's just an hour and a half, and it's just an opportunity to practice alongside others, to get a few practices together. But the monthly groups are for people who've already taken a training either with me or elsewhere, and want to kind of embed it and develop it a bit further. So we do, in these monthly meetings, which are 2 hours, we do a range of practices, but there's also a theme for every month to take the understanding a little bit deeper, and we'll spend time in small groups exploring particular issues and so on. So those are different from a drop-in, which is literally a drop-in, you know, engaging in practice together. Yeah, but they're all kind of, you can find out about that via my website.
Yeah, we'll have to pop a link up with the show.
Yeah, please do.
It's what is the website URL, just for any listeners?
It's www.mindfulnesshampshire.co.uk. So again, very simple. That's what it says on the tin. That's all one word: Mindfulness Hampshire.
Yeah. I think one of the things that got me into kind of more regular pattern of mindfulness was planting tiny little seeds of mindful activity. Like I'd commit to only showering mindfully for a week or something.
Yeah.
Would you recommend things like that?
Oh, definitely. And that's one of the things that we invite people to do in terms of home practice on the 8-week training. Is like, you know, just identify. And I always say to people, identify it now while you're in class. What is it going to be that you're going to do mindfully each day? Because otherwise it's like, oh, I'll think about it later. And then it comes to, oh, it's 3 days since my mindfulness class and I haven't worked out what my routine activity. So just identify a routine activity that you do anyway. So brushing your teeth, or as you say, taking a shower, or could be making a cup of tea, and just commit yourself to, each time I do that, I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to be present. And it shocks people to discover actually how hard that is. It's like, oh, I've just finished cleaning my teeth and I've forgotten, or, you know, started mindfully and then have completely, you know, gone off. Yeah, but I definitely recommend that as a really great way to you know, embed mindfulness in the day-to-day. And I often say, you know, we don't come to this stuff in a sense to learn to sit still on a meditation cushion. for half an hour at a time. We come to this stuff because we want to learn how to be a bit more skillful in our lives. So let's do what we can to just kind of let it filter into our daily life. So having a mindful shower or cup of tea or whatever is really, really helpful stuff. That is practice. It's what we call informal practice, whereas the, sitting on the cushion or lying for the body scan or whatever is the formal practice. Informal practice is really, really key in terms of living a more mindful life.
Bridges the gap, I suppose, doesn't it? We wouldn't want to be, it's 10:45 now. I've done my mindfulness. I can leave mindfulness behind.
Exactly, and then live in complete autopilot for the rest of the day. That's not, that's really missing the point of why you might have come to a training in the first place. Yeah.
Almost forgot my question then. I can word it a bit out. So I've had a number of guests on who've talked about mindfulness and some kind of related fields, acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion focused therapy, and particularly with mindfulness, it seems to be one of these things that, I don't want to say it's a panacea, but it seems to sort of, where the mind goes, mindfulness matters, and it seems to have a positive influence on just about anything that we do, really.
Yeah.
What would you point to as the, I suppose, selling points? What would you say to encourage people to bring mindfulness into their lives?
I suppose there's something about, if we're not aware of how we're living, if we're not conscious of kind of what's going on, how can we, kind of engage in life a little more kind of skillfully, I suppose. So I think many of us have a sense of, I would like to, I don't know, feel a little more at ease or at peace or a little more joyful, or, there's often that sense of wanting be a little bit different or a little bit more. And the first step to that for me is, well, let's come up really close and say, so what is going on? That's a great motivation for becoming more mindful, is that really helps us to, this thought's coming up. That emotion's around, this behavioural pattern is showing itself up again. And there's a lot around, the patterns that we just repeat over and over and over. And mindfulness is brilliant, I think, at helping us wake up to them. We talk a lot, as you all know, about kind of the difference between reacting and responding. And we spend so much of our lives just reacting in the way that we've always reacted. I don't know if you know that expression, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always had, what you've always got. And there's no kind of, there's no blame attached to that. That's just how we operate. And, the Buddhists have known this forever, but in recent years, the kind of neuroscience shows us, doesn't it, that we follow the same old neural pathways. Literally, in terms of the brain scans, they show the electrical activity, jumping across the same synapses in the brain. We follow the same old pattern. And it used to be not that long ago that psychologists thought that's kind of, we're stuck with that. That once you go, you grow up and you become a fully formed adult, and that's kind of who you are. That's your personality and how you live out life. But they're now showing what's termed neuroplasticity up till end of life, which basically the brain is plastic, so we can effectively rewire. We carve out new neural pathways. So people often think, mindfulness, that's all soft and fluffy and gentle. You're rewiring your brain,
Yeah.
You're learning to make different choices, to respond differently to life. But the first step is you need to become aware of what is going on. Yeah.
One thing I really want to do with this show is stress some of that stuff you speak about, the brain surgery we're doing with it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a part of us that, you can compare it to perhaps physical flexibility, physical strength, but really it's much more adaptable, changeable than that, isn't it? Mind.
Absolutely. And it is also, I suppose I wouldn't want people to just feel, well, that's easy, then I'll rewire my brain. It's it takes time, doesn't it? These neural pathways often have been embedded for many, many years. And we're each time we repeat the kind of the behavior or the thinking pattern, the feeling patterns, we're kind of strengthening those pathways to alter them, for them to become, more malleable and plastic, and to make different choices. That's why we call it mindfulness practice. We're practicing over and over.
Mm.
And I sometimes use the analogy of a little bit like you're in the middle of a dense forest, and some predator comes along, a tiger comes along or something, and your autopilot, whoa, I'm going to run down that wide clearing. There's a pathway through the jungle, and you're going to run down that clearing to escape. And that may be your familiar go-to, your familiar pathway. But actually, maybe there's a pit of snakes at the end. So it may not necessarily serve you well. So that could be the same old behavioral pattern of, something challenging comes up in life, and that pattern may be, oh, I'm no good at life, nothing ever works out for me. That may be very, very familiar, a well-trodden path, but it doesn't necessarily serve you well. It could get you into low mood and anxiety and so on. And what we're inviting, in a sense, in mindfulness practice is akin to like carving a new pathway through the jungle. It feels really alien. It's like, oh, this trigger has come along, this predator, or, this threat of whatever sort. And really, I'm going to make a different response. It feels like I'm hacking my way through the undergrowth to make a different choice. But it's, it's awesome that we can do that. And it's practicing time. Oh, I'm noticing that feeling. I'm noticing that trigger, that feeling of, oh, anxiety coming up, or, oh, my mood going down into my boots. Okay. And how does that feel in the body? And what might I need to do? Let me pause here. Let me notice, is there a more skillful response I might be able to make?
There's quite a simple answer to many of those blocks, isn't there? If we get into that noticing position again.
Yeah, again, and then again, that's the first thing, isn't it? If we're not noticing, if we're not mindful, then those choices are not available to us, really. So the first thing is the key thing is that awareness, isn't it? Waking up to what's going on, to our patterns. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that people will often say is that, well, yeah, I've got that autopilot, but really I need it there to stay safe. And I think I was a little drawn into that previously, and it was Professor Alan Langer came on the show when we started out, and she talked about that, and kind of gave an example like you did there of being in the jungle. These sorts of autopilot instincts that might show up could be useful to us, so long as that we have the awareness of them and flexibility with them.
Yes. Yeah, and absolutely, some of those instincts are critical. I mean, it's like, if we're about to step out in front of a bus, we don't want to pause and think, oh, what am I noticing here? Actually, we need to be able to absolutely react. Not respond. There is a time for, reacting is really, really helpful, life-saving. Yeah, but it's having that discernment to notice, isn't it? And a lot of our threats these days aren't necessarily external, like the predator in the jungle or the bus that's going to run us over. They're internal threats. They're all our psychological mechanisms we get in such a stew with. Yeah. And
survival mechanisms arguably kill more than just about anything else, really. If we take it as a broad concept, I suppose. The way that survival instincts influence kind of perhaps behaviors that have a negative outcome in health. Some of the anxiety systems that could lead to suicides and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the perhaps more pleasant end of the advantages we can get from this, one of the things that struck me was that boredom seems like it's inevitable. But to what extent do you think boredom is essentially us slipping into that autopilot and no longer engaging with the thing that we're doing?
Are you meaning boredom within practice?
No, actually, I mean within life, yeah, the things we might be doing. I mean, you sort of assume that boredom is a natural progression as you do things over time. But I was wondering, do you think that we simply just go onto autopilot when we're doing a particular walk or an activity, and when we're in that mode, we're not aware of what's going on, so we're kind of numb to the experience of it and bored? Can you reverse the clock on things that have become boring with mindfulness?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I'm pausing because I'm slightly uncomfortable. Like, am I evangelical about this? I don't actually experience boredom, I don't think, generally these days. Yeah, it's interesting. I can remember my kids when they were young, like, oh, I'm bored. I'm saying, what? There's so much to engage with and to be alive in the world with.
To quote
But then,
T-Rex, life is strange.
yeah,
There's a lot to
yes.
be excited by, isn't there, if we pay
Yeah,
attention?
absolutely. Yes. But I think absolutely, if we are in autopilot, it's almost like a dulling of the senses. We're not awake to what's going on. So the example you give of a walk in the woods is often we're just caught up in our internal mind chatter, probably.
Mm,
So we're not alive to the breeze on our face, or the rustling of the leaves on the
mm,
tree, and all of that stuff. What's right here, right now.
mm,
So there's almost like a dulling, a muting, I think, of the
mm,
immediate environment that can lead to a feeling of, yeah, boredom, or almost like dullness, not fully alive somehow,
mm.
not fully awake. Mm.
There's sort of 15-foot black lampposts outside my house that they're made to look like old gas lamps,
Okay,
and there's bollards that look like cannons, because I lived in the seafront in Portsmouth,
right.
and I sort of half knew they were there, half didn't. And they've got like this gold paint trim on them and things. They're quite beautiful, but it
Yeah,
wasn't. And like we said earlier on, sort of making a commitment to do one thing mindfully. On one day a few months back, it was to walk to the shops and back,
yeah.
and just bring my attention back to my surroundings. And that was when I kind of fully noticed that
Mm.
they were there. And I've lived
Mm.
here about 6 months now.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But how we get almost inoculated to the everyday. It's like we just don't notice what's right under our noses.
Mm,
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
mm. Um,
Mm.
a lot of your work goes into mindful compassion or compassionate mindfulness. How does that differ from what we've been
Yeah,
talking about so far?
yeah. I suppose that's another. I was talking about, when I first came across mindfulness, and my supervisor lent me that book. I had a similarly kind of light bulb moment, or light bulb week, should I say, when I came across the work of Chris Germer and Kristin Neff, two Americans who have a program they designed called Mindful Self-Compassion. And they came over here. I think it was so. I was already immersed in mindfulness, and I was doing my masters at Bangor University, and they were offering a week up on Holy Island, Scotland, of this mindful self-compassion training. And I thought, I'll go along. That sounds quite nice. I thought that sounds like that will be gentle, compassion. That will be kind. Completely turned me inside out and upside down. It was really, really challenging.
Really?
Um, but basically the mindful self-compassion training, and there are a lot, as you say, of kind of compassion trainings around, but this is the particular one that I've got very involved with, and I'm now a teacher trainer for them. It's an international program that I'm very immersed in. But the radical nature of it has really struck me in terms of, yeah, how we meet ourselves. And even if we're really mindful of kind of noticing what's out and about and around us, and what our immediate experience is, and the breath coming and going and all that kind of thing, so many people carry a kind of, ranging from quite quiet to incredibly loud sense of not good enough, that internal, that inner critic, that I'm not quite right, there's something lacking. And the mindful self-compassion training is really focused on helping us to relate more kindly to ourselves, and the win-win is therefore more kindly to others as well. There's a lot of research that shows that unless we really have the basis for relating kindly to ourselves, the capacity to wholeheartedly relate very kindly and compassionately to others is never as fully developed as it might be. And it's just an awesome program, and it's based on, I suppose, just to give you a rough overview, the way it's conceptualized, are kind of three key components. So there's mindfulness is kind of the foundation. Again, as I was saying earlier, if we're not aware of what's going on, how can we learn to respond more skillfully? So mindfulness. And the second component is one that's termed common humanity. And I think this is particularly key to what's called MSC for short, mindful self-compassion. It's particularly key to that training, more so than I've seen in other compassion trainings. So this sense of common humanity is really majoring on the sense that actually we all struggle at times. And often when we struggle, it's a little bit like our perceptual field narrows. We kind of close down, oh, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my life? Or I'm no good, or this isn't working out for me. And And it's really helping us to recognize that it's part and parcel of the human condition that we have tough times. Actually, that's what connects us. That's what we have in common. And so really, that's integral to the training, that we are coming out of that place all the time. I'm not alone. Probably if you're thinking about a situation, some of the exercises you go through, well, actually, most people may have reacted to this situation the same as I have. Or it's a group program. Everybody in this room right now is reflecting on some area of difficulty in their life. Oh, that's what we have in common. And there's a lovely video of Kristen Neff, one of the program developers, who talks about, where did you sign that contract saying you're going to have a perfect life? Actually, it's normal to struggle, to have tough times. Life is a blend of the pleasant, the unpleasant, and everything in between. This is what's normal, and this is what connects us. So particularly in those tough times, remembering that is key. And then the third piece is around self-kindness, kind of obvious in a way. That sense of, what do I need right now, given this is here, given I'm having a tough time or a challenge with this or that. What do I need? What would be a kindness? And usually that's the last thing we ask ourselves. We're more likely to say, what's wrong with me, or judge ourselves for not being good enough. But it's actually saying, oh, what would help? What do I need right now? Which is enormous. And there's a whole body of research. I mean, Kristen is a huge researcher. She's the academic. Well, I'm not saying Chris isn't academic, but he's also a clinician. So he brought his clinical skills together with Kristen's researcher skills. But there's a huge body of research, much of which Kristen has done, but she's pulled from all sorts of other researchers, also showing what a huge difference it makes to actually respond self-compassionately. Because a lot of people think, oh, is that self-indulgent? Is that self-pity? Will I just get weaker? Will I lack motivation? The research shows completely the opposite. It really helps us build the resources to be more resilient, more proactive, hugely helpful response to anxiety states and low mood states, taking care of ourselves better, and all sorts of physical health indicators, relationship improvement. I'm getting on my soapbox now, but you can maybe tell it's made an enormous difference to my life, and it's just a great pleasure to share it with people. And even after having been immersed, as I say, as a therapist for many years, and then as a mindfulness teacher, this for me there was also this missing piece around the self-kindness. So the self-compassion has been really another kind of life changer, I suppose, in many ways. And just seeing the ways in which, working with participants and training teachers to work with participants, also the sense of, what really can I be acceptable? Can I begin to imagine that I'm acceptable as I am? And that's not about condoning, our bad behavior or our traits, which, might merit some work, if you like. But it's almost like just by dint of existing, this is just a human being who happens to be on this planet. Can I tend to them with some care, some concern for ourselves and for others? And the direction of travel when we embrace that kind of approach is life enhancing. People become more at ease, more joyful, more helpful to themselves and to others. It's kind of I don't know to think of the word I'm looking for, but the direction of travel is kind of a helpful one, a positive one. Contrary to what people might first think when they hear about it, it's quite the opposite. It's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to say, I'm worthy just because I exist. I'm worthy. I may have some challenges, but yeah.
And I think counterintuitive to think that to approach, you gave the example of problematic behaviours, to approach them with compassion is probably the better way to actually see some change, be it ourselves or others.
Yes, well, there's an expression, isn't there? You probably know it, like, kind of, what you resist persists. And so if we're saying, oh, there's this horrible problematic behaviour, or don't want that, let's push that away, but what we resist persists. But if we can bring it into the light of mindfulness, the flip side of that is what you can feel, you can heal. So it's like with support and with kindness, can we have a look at what's going on here? Let's notice what thoughts are coming up, what feelings are here, how are we behaving? And then it's almost like some alchemy goes on. That we can, things can begin to shift and change. And I really like the way that one of the psychologists that's quoted in the Mindful Self-Compassion training is Carl Rogers, which is very much where I started back with a person-centered approach eons ago in my initial counsellor training. And he talks about the curious paradox. And the curious paradox is, if I can accept myself as I am, then change becomes possible. And I see that time and time again in the Mindful Self-Compassion training. So we don't want to get rid of what's going on. It's almost like we need to embrace what's here. And then this alchemy happens and shift and change becomes possible. But it's not about approaching it in the interests of change, because then it's resistance. And that's the curious paradox. It's like we need to wholeheartedly embrace ourselves as we are, warts and all, as they say, and then something magical happens, and people begin to value themselves and find kinder ways of regarding themselves and their history and their present, and so on, and one another.
There's a couple of paradoxical bits and bobs, isn't there, when practicing mindfulness? I think that for me, it seems that's where a lot of people get stuck. For example, the outcome of mindfulness might be that you feel quite clear in the mind and feel quite calm. But as you said, if we're going into mindfulness thinking, right, this is what I'm going to achieve, I must clear my mind and become calm, that ain't going to work.
No, exactly. Yeah, so it is, it's quite a courageous step, I often think. And again, we were talking earlier about, it's difficult for people to know what they're getting into. We can talk about mindfulness and about self-compassion and so on, but there's something about experiencing it that is different from the description. And I think it does invite people to dig deep, to come up close alongside, actually, what is here? What is going on in my life? How am I living? How have I been? And what's my history been? And, it can bring up a lot of stuff. But it also is providing the skills to work with what does come up in a conscious way, and ultimately in a kind and life-enhancing way.
One of the things that interests me about compassion, or the same is true for mindfulness, I'm sure, is that it isn't something that someone has invented. It was something that was discovered, and that actually that we've got hardware for this stuff. And this is perhaps where it goes into the brain science stuff, which can back up some of what may at first glance seem fluffy. Could you talk to us a bit about some of the motivational systems for compassion?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the sort of the physiology, I think what we often talk about, and certainly in the Mindful Self-Compassion program, is that we are really majoring on accessing and developing what's termed the mammalian caregiving system, or Paul Gilbert talks about it as the affiliative system, or it can be termed the soothing system. And as you say, this is natural. We all have this capacity because we're mammals. We know how to do this stuff. But we spend a huge amount of our time instead in the kind of threat defense system, where we're, the fight, flight, freeze. And as we were talking earlier, that can be helpful if there's a real kind of physical threat. But a lot of our threats are internal, are psychological, are worries, relationship things, or financial things, or whatever. And that doesn't necessarily serve us so well. So it's about recognizing that when we get triggered, when we get activated by something, I'm feeling that kind of fight or flight or freeze response. Another one we can definitely get caught up is the sort of drive reward system, which is the kind of achieving. And you may have heard umpteen people, I certainly have. So I really need to sort myself out, pull myself together, that kind of, as though we could use some sense of mastery to problem solve ourselves. And not, the drive reward system is great for all sorts of, things that might need achieving in that way. But in terms of psychological well-being, isn't necessarily the most helpful system at times. But what's termed this mammalian caregiving system. I mean, you see it with mammals. You kind of see a lioness and a lion cub kind of nuzzled up together, and they purr and they lick, and your monkeys groom each other. And like, us with our offspring, you see a child perhaps fall over and graze their knees, and it's an instinct, it's an automatic response to soothe them in some way, to calm and soothe and so on. And we're pretty good at doing that to others. You know, it's hardwired. It's, as you say, it doesn't have to be invented. We have these skills at our fingertips and this system at our fingertips. But what is really sad is actually we're not so good at using that system in relation to ourselves. One of the exercises we do quite early on in the mindful self-compassion training is invite people to reflect for a little while on how they treat a friend when a friend is having a hard time. So somebody that they care about, who's you know, that they have an uncomplicated relationship with and think well of, and you know, how do you treat them when they're having a tough time? They've suffered some adversity, or they feel they've screwed up in some way, or they're really just feeling a bit down. How do you treat them? What do you say to them? Do you do anything? And what's your general attitude towards them? And the vast majority of people are saying, oh, well, actually, you know, I give them time, I give them space, you know, see what I can do to support them. I might do something practical. I might even give them a hug in the days of before social distancing. You know, all of that. And then we get them to look at, and, you know, just thinking of times when you've been having a hard time, how do you treat yourself? You know, what do you do? How do you behave? What do you say to yourself? And generally, how do you treat yourself? And they're often really quite shocked that, oh my goodness, it's such a different story. I'm really critical of myself. I push myself harder, you know, do all sorts of things that are not imbued with kindness at all. The kindness that comes really naturally to a dear friend who's in difficulty. And so it's about learning that actually we have these skills completely at our fingertips. We have the capacity to respond kindly, but it's usually directed outward and not inward. So we're learning, what might it be like to tend to myself as I would tend to somebody I really cared about? And even just saying that, it's like, well, am I not somebody I really care about then? You know, it can be shocking for people to discover that that's how they're living their lives. You know, many of us carry this around for years and years and years. And so a shorthand way of remembering those three components I was speaking of, the mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, the shorthand is treating ourselves as we would treat a good friend. You know, just remembering that. How am I relating to myself when I'm, you know, saying, oh, I'm just going to, you know, stay up another half an hour to finish off those emails when I'm absolutely knackered, you know? Oh, would you be encouraging a friend to do that? Or would you be saying, do you know what, you've had a really full day. Why don't you turn in now? Those sorts of things. How am I treating myself when I'm, you know, eating in a way that isn't serving me, or, you know, allowing myself to get all caught up in this, that, and the other, all the shoulds and oughts of life. Yeah.
It's not always immediately obvious, the kind of way we relate to ourselves, I think. I know for me that kind of really actively noticing, you know, consciously trying to be more aware of perhaps how I think about myself or speak to myself.
Absolutely. It's completely below the radar for most of us. And as I say, when I went off and did this week with Chris and Kristen up on Holy Isle, for me, having been immersed in therapy and mindfulness for many years, there was still, it's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea actually how hard I was on myself, how self-critical I was. It was, you know, it's quite shocking to discover that. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, like all of us, I'm always still a work in progress. We all are. It's never get to the point of I've arrived, you know.
Oh, not me. I'm perfect.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Well done.
No, I finished it completely.
Yeah.
What kind of blocks do you come across for compassion most commonly?
Oh, I guess what we call habitual tendencies. You know, those just hardwired, that we were talking earlier on about the kind of neuroscience of it all, and just following those same old pathways of, oh yeah, there I go again, you know, giving myself a hard time. Yeah, so it's a continual, you know, work in progress to notice it, to catch it, and little by little, the direction of travel is, generally speaking, for all of us in a, you know, who engage in practice and in training over time, is in a more, you know, what Carl Rogers might call kind of self-actualized direction. Yeah. But you know, those habits are well embedded, and it's about being forgiving and being kind to us. Oh, it's that old chestnut again. Of course, I've gone down that same old road. You may know, we often share it in mindfulness trainings, that poem by Portia Nelson called "A Hole in the Sidewalk," where there's a hole in this, I can't remember how it goes. It's called Autobiography in 5 chapters, but there's basically the first chapter, there's a hole in the sidewalk and you walk along and you fall in it. And it's like, oh, how did I get here? And this is no good. And then the second chapter is you walk along and you see the hole in the sidewalk and you still fall in. And how did that happen? And then the third chapter is you walk along and you still fall in the hole in the sidewalk. But I know this one. I've been here before. It is my fault. I fell down here. This was kind of my doing. Here I go again. And then the fourth chapter, I can't remember. You see the hole in the sidewalk and you walk around it. I'm not going down that same old pathway again. Falling that same trap, if you like. And then the final chapter, the 5th chapter, is you walk along a different street. There's no hole in the sidewalk on that street. But it's that sense when you say what gets in the way, what are the blocks to compassion? It's our habitual tendencies. They're been wired in often over a lifetime, and we need to work with them persistently and gently and kindly and little by little. There's movement, and it can be absolutely transformational. That doesn't mean occasionally we still find ourselves going down an old familiar path that maybe doesn't serve so well. That's just part of being human.
New holes and new roads.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. I think my experience coming into compassion was that, coming into compassion at work formally, was that up here, I didn't have any sort of resistance towards compassion. I grew up loving Alan Watts and stuff like that, and so I didn't have any problem with it at all, cognitively. And yet, again, as I became more aware of things and more aware of myself when I was doing these exercises, I noticed that when we do begin to talk about compassion, sometimes there's just a little bit of resistance that I can feel, a little bit of discomfort towards it. And I wonder if that's more common in men. There is a culture around being a tough guy, isn't there? But
absolutely. Yeah.
It's not always something that we think, is it? It can be something that we feel resistant towards.
Yes, and also I was talking earlier about that kind of negative self-talk, that inner critic, and not everybody experiences that. It can be more just of a feeling of somehow lacking or not quite good enough. So it isn't always that clear. And I think you're right about the gender thing as well. In fact, the MSc program, it's a centre for MSc, which is the home of all of this work, and they do have a program that is just for men as well, because it's sometimes it can be quite difficult, and a little bit like in therapy and mindfulness as well. The majority of participants tend to be female, but there's there's that kind of training. We're often socialised to be tough guys, to be providers and not be emotional and all the rest of it. And women are often socialized a lot to take care of others rather than themselves, and all of that. So there's a whole massive combination of influences on us that can make it challenging to come into a real compassionate relationship to ourselves.
Absolutely. And to make it even more tricky, I think, even if you really don't associate yourself with that kind of culture, you can still feel the pressure of those expectations, even if you completely kind of don't agree that should be the case.
Yes, absolutely. And there's the kind of the agreement or disagreement intellectually, but then there's the felt sense in the body, and there's and living in a social world where you're interacting with others, and that need for connection means we want to be part of a peer group or a society, and the society may have norms that we feel slightly out of step with, and that is a pressure. And how does all that show up for us?
How would you normally work with blocks to compassion in your work, if someone is resistant perhaps towards it?
Good question. I think there's something about the radical nature of acceptance. I'm spending a bit of time doing some exploring some of Tara Brach's work at the moment, and you're probably aware, she wrote a book called Radical Acceptance, and there's also a Radical Compassion program as well. And one of the things that she talks about that I find particularly helpful, we talk in mindfulness circles about, if there's something here that's difficult, we talk about turning towards the difficult. So in this example, there's a block to compassion. We could turn towards it, and it's here anyway, and how might we be with this? And there's a phrase that she used that I'm quite taken by, is that It's not like it, you know, it's here, how might I be with it? This belongs. We're not saying, you know, it's a good thing, but this belongs, is part of my experience. So this block, this resistance to compassion, it's not saying, how do we get rid of this block? How do we get rid of this resistance? It's like trusting our kind of innate wisdom as whole, you know, living organisms, if you like, that this belongs, this is part of me and part of who I am. May I allow it to be here? You know, the RAIN acronym, probably, that, you know, the kind of recognizing what's here, this feeling of, no, I can't be compassionate, you know, I can't be kind to myself, you know, recognizing, allowing it to be here. And that's different from condoning it and saying it's a good thing, but yeah, fully letting it show up. How am I experiencing this? What thoughts are here? What feelings are here? How am I behaving? How's it feel in the body? All of that stuff. Investigating it, really getting familiar with what's going on. And then the, you know, the end is the kind of nurturing. How do I tend to this and to myself with kindness? So it's not, we're not getting rid of a block or overcoming resistance. We're kind of embracing it. And she talks about the ocean. It's almost a bit like we're a whole ocean here. And this is a wave within the ocean, this resistance or this block to compassion, as you know, we might term it. That's just a part of the whole piece. Of course, you know, that's just part of our experience. It isn't the whole of us, but this too is here. And let me tend to it. Let me tend to it with kindness, not to get rid of it. It's just a wave in the ocean, you know.
So you're not looking to resist it and have it persist.
No, exactly. You're going to feel it so you can heal it.
Yeah, and it does belong.
It does, yeah.
And you don't belong to it. And you sort of, we try and zoom out a little bit, I suppose, to get the freedom there.
Yeah, so we can notice it using, you know, our mindfulness. It's like, oh, this is what's here. Really recognizing that's what here, it belongs, not in the sense I want it and it's a good thing, I want to keep it, but it's just part of me and my experience right now. So let's tend to it and myself with kindness. Yeah.
I always think of getting a song stuck in your head, a good sort of analogy of what happens when you do try to get rid of a thought process, when you do try and remove content from your mind. Good luck with that.
Yes.
That I was mindfully potting around the house yesterday, just sort of being aware of where my mind was going, what it was doing, and we use these examples of maybe some painful critical self-talk, maybe some pleasant memories, maybe some painful memories, but it's just strange sometimes, isn't it? I mean, what I noticed was that my mind was playing me one section of a Coldplay song, and I don't like Coldplay, but it was just a few lyrics from one of their songs that were just going over and over, and you think, well, it's quite a strange little fella sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, where's that come from? Why is that playing on repeat in my mind? Yeah, but also our, you know, kind of our inner stories are often doing that all of the time, which is, you know, it's almost like, you know, I'm sort of thinking of people first coming to mindfulness training, say, well, what do I want to do this for? And I suppose the answer might be, well, our minds kind of have a mind of their own. They're playing things on repeat. They're following all these patterns over and over. So a sense in which, you know, that's kind of can end up writing your life story if you don't notice what's going on and make a conscious choice about how you want to be with it. So you may have a life of Coldplay if you hadn't come to mindfulness. That could have written your life script. You're going round and round that loop forever.
There you go, guys. If that didn't sell it. Just coming back to your point about recognizing the way we relate to ourselves, because we do all relate to ourselves, don't we? You know, I know some don't experience a internal monologue. There's a kind of subsection of people that don't experience that, but we all kind of relate to ourselves, and recognizing how I relate to myself. One of the kind of shift moments for me was not just paying attention to the content, but to the kind of way it's delivered. So if you think about someone who's very, very angry, they may say something that, you know, transcribed would just be, can you please help me with X? But in the tone of that, you can pick up a hugely different message. And paying attention to that for me was one of the shifts in just noticing the relationship with yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And it's often in the tone of voice. And I can remember way back from that you know, my initial experience when I took the MSc program as a participant. And one of the pieces that we do is looking at a particular maybe behavior that you would like to change and that you often give yourself a hard time for. And we're kind of guided through a series of steps at looking at kind of how, you know, what do you say to yourself? And mine was, I'm happy to share, it was fairly innocuous on the surface of things, because I've got this habit of kind of chewing the crooks of my fingers, you know, not my fingernail, just kind of around the edges. And I've been trying to stop it forever. It's like, you know, I don't know how many years I've been chewing my fingers. Not a very pleasant habit, and sometimes it hurts. You kind of tear the skin a bit. But what I discovered I was saying to myself was, you know, the tone of voice was hideous. It wasn't out loud, but that internal tone of like, look at what you're doing to yourself. What a disgusting habit. You're never going to sort this out. You'll never change this. And then the final stab was, and you're supposed to be a mindfulness teacher. But it was, you know, it's like, oh my goodness, that's how I'm talking to myself. That tone. The words were pretty cutting, but the tone was the main thing. It's like, you know, I wouldn't speak to my worst enemy with that tone of voice. But there I was, you know, a therapist, a mindfulness teacher, talking to myself in that way. It was, yeah, it was really quite revealing. And what we often do with that is then, so having got kind of coming up close to that kind of critical voice, whether it's literally a voice or it's a tone or it's a feeling in the body, and then kind of giving it a bit of airspace, getting familiar with it, and then seeing if we might connect with a more compassionate internal voice. And sometimes a way into that is, what might you say to somebody you really cared about who's in the same, you know, struggling with the same behavior? And I was coming out and it's like, oh, I'm so sorry you're struggling with this, or, you know, I really care about you. I'd love to support you with changing this behavior. And it's like, whoa, the difference was incredible, you know, the way that I speak to. And so, you know, little by little, the invitation is to learn that way of speaking to ourselves, you know, develop an inner compassionate voice rather than the inner critical voice. Yeah.
You would speak to your friend like that, I'd suggest, not just because you care for them, but you care for what they want to change as well.
Absolutely. Yes, you want to support them.
Yeah. You don't scream and shout at your kids at sports day. It's not just because you're nice to them, it's because you're aware that they're probably going to actually do a lot worse if you're screaming and shouting at them.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's in the interests of, you know, whatever it is that's trying to be achieved as well, isn't it? As well as the actual person. Yeah.
Just mindful that we've been, I think we're coming up to about an hour now since we started recording. So I'll have to cut it down a little bit, probably take out the toilet break.
That won't hold you, listeners.
No, but it's a 60-minute show. So are there any kind of final remarks or messages that you haven't had a chance to convey yet that you want to finish with? I can ask you a question to prompt that, make it seem fluid if you like.
I suppose what occurs to me is we've been talking quite a lot about how these approaches, mindfulness and mindful self-compassion, can really help us to kind of navigate kind of the challenges of life, you know, when difficulties around. So I suppose I would also want to add in, there's something about really, you know, we have a tendency to look for what's wrong. You know, you'll know about that, the kind of default mode network, kind of negativity bias. But we do spend quite a lot of time in these programs also looking at, so how do we cultivate what's right? How do we build what's right? How do we sense into what's good here? How do we savor it? So often with our tendency to look for what's wrong, we overlook what's right and we dismiss it. A little bit like, you know, when you ask somebody, oh, how do I look in this outfit? And 9 out of 10 people say, oh, you look fab. And one person, oh, I'm not sure that's your color. What do you remember? You know, the person who says that's not your color. But it's the same, I think, with these, you know, these looking at what's going on in our lives and our heart and mind states. We often overlook what's right. So we do spend a lot of time in these programs really sensing to actually what's good, you know, noticing the detail of something pleasant. You'll know from the 8-week mindfulness trainings, looking at pleasant events and savoring them, really allowing them to land and drink them in. And in the MSc program, we spend time looking at gratitude. And you know, there's a lot out there in popular press about how helpful it is to have a conscious gratitude practice, to look at what's right here. So what is there that's good, that I can sense into, that I can savor, that I'm grateful for, and also appreciation. And we do a lot around self-appreciation. It's like, oh my goodness, can I appreciate myself? Oh, how hard is that? Appreciate our own good qualities. But again, we're not saying that I always exhibit these qualities, and I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else, but really supporting people and owning that this is true about me. Actually, I do quite like this aspect of myself. And you can imagine from the beginning of a training, when people are coming, often feeling really very self-critical and not so good about themselves, to getting often so they can genuinely find things that I can own this. Yeah, I do like this in me. So we spend quite a lot of time also really, not just with all the challenging stuff, although interestingly, sometimes inviting the positive can be really challenging, because it's not familiar. It's not our, our familiar territory for a lot of people. And we have a laugh, I suppose, is the other thing to say. There's something about holding it all a bit lightly and holding ourselves not too seriously, and bringing some real warmth and humor when appropriate into the work in mindfulness and self-compassion. It feels to me a real kind of key ingredient. Yeah.
I want to come along now.
Please do. You'd be very welcome. Yeah.
Well, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, really nice.
It's been really great. I always find that I've had quite a varying, different types of guests, and I've always found there's something unique that's brought by each of them. So yeah, it's really nice having you on. It's really helpful.
Yeah, and thank you for being such a kindly and easy interviewer. Yes. Yeah, no, it's been really nice getting a sense of you and what's going on with you and your work, but also that sense of your own internal world and noticing the lampposts and the cannons and all the rest of that in the mind.
Yeah, no, I feel like I'm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There's something about bringing it to life, isn't it? As as teachers or therapists or whatever, there's something and us too. We're human beings, and we only do this stuff because we know it from the inside of being a human being, warts and all, and how it all shows up for us. So I've really appreciated connecting at that level with you.
Yeah, like I said, I loved Alan Watson since I was a kid, and really bought into a lot of his philosophies and Buddhist stuff, but I also had that hat where I really liked academia and science, and these two things I kind of entertained separately. And then as I've did CBT and then eventually came into what some might call third wave therapies, ACT, CFT and stuff, and mindfulness.
Yeah.
And it's this real awakening where it's like, actually, these are when it comes to answering human suffering, human striving, or what have you, the science and the Alan Wattsy stuff, most of it is
all comes together.
Comes together.
Yeah.
And,
wonderful.
That's just given me so much energy for this work.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed.